Evelyn sat by the window, her weathered hands folding a dish towel she'd already folded twice before. Her eyes gazed into the backyard where the autumn leaves swirled in slow circles. It had been another quiet day in a string of many. Her house, once alive with the clatter of pots, pans, and children's laughter, now echoed with the soft creaks of the old floorboards and the ticking of the grandfather clock. But that quiet was broken by a familiar sound, the light, purposeful steps of her 12-year-old grandson, Caleb. "Grandma, it smells like rain," Caleb said, his voice clear but measured, his gaze focused on the window like he was trying to decode a mystery only he could see. His observations were always sharp like that, seeing details others missed. Evelyn smiled softly, folding the towel again, more for something to do than out of necessity. "Rain's coming, huh?" she said, looking at him. His eyes didn't leave the window. "Well, maybe it's a good day for something indoors." Caleb turned to her, tilting his head slightly, a habit of his when he was thinking deeply. "Can I see the attic?" he asked suddenly, his eyes bright with curiosity. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "The attic? What on earth for?" "Just want to see it," Caleb replied, his eyes not blinking, his gaze locked on hers like he was waiting for her to solve a riddle. Evelyn sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. She hadn't been up to the attic in years, not since Frank passed. Boxes of forgotten moments, old furniture, and stacks of memories lived up there. "All right," she muttered, "but don't go breaking anything. Half the stuff up there is older than me." Minutes later, they stood at the top of the narrow stairs. Caleb moved slowly, his hands brushing along the wooden beams, eyes darting around like he discovered a new planet. Evelyn opened a window to let in some air, and for a moment, the smell of cedar and old paper filled the room. She watched him move from box to box, his small hands tracing shapes on the cardboard lids. Then he stopped. It wasn't a box that caught his attention, but something on one of the old shelves, a leather-bound book with a gold clasp that had long since dulled. His fingers hovered over it, then carefully, almost reverently, he pulled it down. It wasn't heavy, but the weight of it felt different somehow. "What's this?" Caleb asked, turning to her with the album in his hands. Evelyn froze. She knew exactly what it was. Her breath caught in her chest as her eyes locked on the worn leather. "Just an old photo album," she said slowly, taking a step forward. She hadn't seen it in decades, but the sight of it opened a door she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through. Caleb glanced at her, sensing the hesitation, his eyes studying her face like a puzzle. "Can I look?" he asked, already opening the first page before she could respond. Evelyn stepped forward, her heart thudding in her chest, but she didn't stop him. There they were, black and white photos, faded with time but clear enough to see faces, places, moments long past. Caleb's fingers traced each one like he was trying to feel the memory itself. A photo of Evelyn as a little girl on a swing. Another of her parents in front of a car with white-walled tires. His head tilted as he absorbed it all. "Is that you?" he asked, pointing at a girl in a polka-dot dress holding a fishing rod. Evelyn nodded, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "That was me, all right. I caught a fish that day, so big, I thought I'd hooked a shark." Caleb's eyes flicked to her, lips curling into a small grin. "You don't look scared," he said plainly, turning the page. "Not back then, I wasn't," Evelyn replied with a wink. They turned the pages together, Caleb asking questions that only a child with his mind would think to ask. Why did everyone wear hats? Why was everything black and white? Who was that man with the dog? And Evelyn answered everyone, her memories slowly becoming stories, her voice warming as the weight of the past felt lighter with every answer. But then he stopped again. This time, his eyes lingered longer. He squinted, then looked up at her. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing to a photo of a young man in a military uniform standing next to a girl in a floral dress. The girl was Evelyn. The boy was Henry. The breath left Evelyn's lungs, and she felt like the air in the attic had grown thin. Her hands pressed against her chest, as if she could steady her heart through sheer will. She glanced at Caleb, his eyes fixed on her face, waiting for an answer. "That," she said, her voice quieter than before, "is Henry." She said his name slowly, tasting every letter, like it was a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years, and she hadn't. "Is he Grandpa?" Caleb asked, his head tilting again. "No, honey," she replied softly, her gaze still on the photo. Her eyes lingered on Henry's face, so familiar yet so far away. "No, he wasn't." Caleb studied her with that unblinking, steady stare. "Where is he?" he asked, like it was the most obvious question in the world. Evelyn didn't have an answer, at least not one that would satisfy him. She swallowed hard. "Life had different plans for us," she replied, her voice tight, her eyes still locked on Henry. Caleb nodded slowly, like he understood, though she doubted he did. He turned the page, but Evelyn didn't follow. Her eyes stayed in the photo of Henry, her heart caught in a memory she had buried long ago. The following week, Caleb kept asking to see the photo. "Can I see the album again, Grandma?" It became a daily request, like it had become a part of his routine. He'd sit at the kitchen table, flipping straight to the page where Henry's face stared back at him. Caleb would draw it, copying every detail with a pencil and paper. Each time, his drawing got more accurate, more precise. "Why do you keep drawing him, sweetheart?" Evelyn asked one afternoon, watching him shade in the brim of Henry's military cap. "Because he's important," Caleb replied simply, not looking up. He didn't elaborate. He never did. But his certainty hit Evelyn harder than she expected. Important. She hadn't thought of Henry as important in a long time. She thought she'd moved on, buried the past. But Caleb saw something she didn't. That night, Evelyn had a dream about Henry. She was 17 again, standing in a field with him. The summer sun was hot on their skin, and she could feel the warmth of his hand in hers. He turned to her, his brown eyes crinkling as he smiled. It felt so real she could hear his voice, his laugh. But then, like all dreams, it slipped away. When she woke, her pillow was damp with tears she hadn't realized she cried. The next morning, Evelyn found Caleb at the kitchen table, the album open once again. He had his pencil in hand, tapping on the photo of Henry. Tap, tap, tap. He looked up at her with that same steady gaze. "If you miss him, why don't you find him?" he asked, his words sharper than she expected. She stopped cold, her breath caught in her throat. "Some people aren't meant to be found, Caleb," she said, shaking her head with a short laugh. Caleb tilted his head. "How do you know?" he replied. Simple, direct, the way he always spoke. Evelyn didn't have a good answer for him. That night, as she sat on the couch with her tea, she stared at her laptop on the coffee table. It had been months since she used it, and only for video calls. But now it sat there open, waiting. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She felt foolish. How do you search for someone you lost 60 years ago? Slowly, she typed his name, Henry Whitmore. She hit enter. Her heart pounded as a flood of results filled the screen. Most were useless. Random names, people who weren't him. But one link stood out. An article with a headline that made her breath catch. Veteran Henry Whitmore honored for decades of service to local community. Her fingers hovered over the link. Her eyes filled with tears she hadn't realized were there. "Could it really be you?" she whispered to herself. She clicked. The room was still except for the faint hum of the laptop's cooling fan. Evelyn's eyes stayed locked on the screen, her fingers hovering over the mouse like she was afraid one wrong click would shatter the moment. Her heart thudded in her chest, a heavy, deliberate beat that echoed in her ears. Veteran Henry Whitmore, honored for decades of service to local community. Her eyes scanned the article preview. Beneath the headline was a small photo, grainy but clear enough. It was him. It was Henry. Older, of course. His hair was silver, his face lined with age, but his smile was exactly the same. The same crinkle around the eyes. The same quiet warmth she remembered from summer nights under the stars. She felt something sharp in her chest, like she'd been holding her breath for decades and was only now letting it go. Her fingers twitched over the mouse. Do I click it? She thought. She sat back, rubbing her hands together to steady them. It felt ridiculous to feel this way at her age. This wasn't some old romance movie where long-lost lovers found each other with a single glance. This was real life. People moved on. People changed. I've changed, she told herself. He's changed. But still, she clicked. The page loaded slowly, every second stretching into eternity. When it finally appeared, she leaned in closer, her eyes darting across the text. It was a local news story from a small town 3 states away. The article praised Henry for his volunteer work with local veterans and at-risk youth, calling him a pillar of the community and a man of quiet strength and compassion. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line as she read. She knew that compassion. She'd felt it herself all those years ago. Her eyes flicked back to the photo. She stared at him for a long time, her fingers lightly brushing the screen like she could somehow feel him through it. You're still out there, she whispered, barely able to believe it herself. Grandma, what are you doing? The voice startled her so badly she gasped, slamming the laptop shut like she'd been caught doing something illegal. Caleb stood in the doorway, head tilted, his eyes darting from her face to the closed laptop. Nothing, honey, she said too quickly, brushing at her eyes. Just checking the weather. Caleb blinked, his gaze sharp, cutting right through her excuse. You don't cry about the weather, he said flatly, stepping closer. Is it about him? Her breath caught. He didn't have to say the name. She knew who he meant. Henry. Her hands felt suddenly too empty, like they needed to be holding something, so she reached for her teacup, even though it was already cold. Caleb watched her closely, his eyes scanning her face for clues like he always did. Caleb, she said softly, trying to find the right words. Sometimes, grown-ups get lost in old memories. That's all this is. He tilted his head again, a small frown tugging at his lips. Is he still alive? Her eyes darted to the closed laptop. Her throat tightened. Yes, she admitted quietly. Then it's not just a memory, Caleb said simply, his eyes locked on hers like he was challenging her. He turned and walked to the kitchen table, pulling out a chair and sitting down. He folded his hands on the table like he was ready for business. So, what's the plan? She blinked at him, eyebrows raised. The plan. You're gonna find him, right? He asked, his tone as matter-of-fact as if he'd asked her to cook dinner. You already looked him up. Evelyn shook her head slowly. Sweetheart, it's not that simple. Why not? He shot back, his tone firm but not harsh. You found him. Caleb, people don't just walk back into each other's lives after 60 years. She sighed, running her hands through her hair. It's complicated. No, it's not, he said, drumming his fingers on the table. If you want to see him, you see him. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that life isn't like that? That sometimes doors close and you don't get to open them again. But when she looked at Caleb, she saw the stubborn tilt of his jaw, the steady patience in his eyes, and something about it reminded her of Henry, the way he never gave up on people. She sat down across from him at the table. What if he doesn't want to see me? She asked, her voice small, almost like a confession. Then you'll know, Caleb replied with a shrug. But you won't have to wonder anymore. His words hit her like a stone to the chest. For so many years, she told herself that Henry was gone, out of reach. But it wasn't true, was it? He was still there, still alive, still living his life. And maybe, just maybe, there was room in it for her. The following day, while Caleb was at school, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a laptop in front of her. Her hands hovered over the keys, her fingers curling and uncurling like they didn't know what to do. What would I even say? She wondered. "Hey, Henry, remember me?" She groaned, pressing her palms to her eyes. This was ridiculous. She was 76 years old. People didn't do this at 76. But then she thought of Caleb's words. Then you won't have to wonder anymore. She opened the laptop and went back to the article. At the bottom, there was a name and email address for the local journalist who wrote it. She clicked it. A blank email window appeared. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Her heart pounded like it hadn't in years. Her fingers hovered over the keys for so long, the screen dimmed. She jiggled the mouse to wake it back up. "Stop being a coward," she muttered to herself. Her fingers moved, slowly at first, then faster. The words appeared on the screen before she had time to second-guess them. "Hello, my name is Evelyn Harper. I'm reaching out because I saw your article about Henry Whitmore. I believe I knew him many years ago, and I was wondering if there is any way to get in touch with him. I understand if that's not possible, but if you can help me, I would be so grateful. Thank you for your time." She sat there, reading it over and over. Her heart thudded in her chest. Her finger hovered over the send button. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and pressed it. The email was gone. Just like that. She sat back in her chair, her hands still on the table, eyes wide. "What did I just do?" she muttered. She stared at the screen, waiting for a reply, even though she knew it wouldn't come right away. Her hands shook as she got up and started pacing the kitchen. She wiped down the counters, folded towels, cleaned the sink, anything to keep herself busy. When Caleb got home from school, he spotted her wiping down the same countertop for the fourth time. He dropped his backpack by the door and gave her a look. "Did you do it?" he asked. She stopped, her hand frozen on the counter. Slowly, she turned to face him. She didn't have to ask what he meant. He knew. "Yeah," she said softly. "I did." Caleb's face lit up, his smile wide but quiet, like he didn't want to break the moment. "Good," he said, walking past her to get a glass of water. She sat at the table again, watching him fill his cup. She shook her head, laughing to herself. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" "I am smart," Caleb replied without missing a beat, taking a long sip of water. Later that night, she checked her email. Her heart leapt into her throat when she saw it. A reply. It was from the journalist. "Hi, Evelyn. Thanks for reaching out. I actually know Mr. Whitmore personally. He's a wonderful man, still as sharp as ever. I'd be happy to pass along your message if you'd like. Just let me know what you'd like me to say." Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. She sat there for a long moment, staring at the screen, her heart racing like a girl half her age. She glanced toward the living room, where Caleb sat on the floor, sketching. Her heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in years. "What do I say to him after all this time?" she whispered. From the living room, Caleb called back. "You say, 'Hi, it's me.'" Tears welled up in her eyes. "Yeah," she said, wiping her cheek. "Yeah, I guess that's all it takes." Evelyn barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind swirled with questions. What will he say? Will he even remember me? What if he doesn't care? She tossed and turned, her heart thudding louder than the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the living room. At 2:43 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely. She shuffled out of bed, pulled on her slippers, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea. Her eyes kept darting to the laptop, her heart still tangled in knots. By 7 a.m., she had checked her email 3 times. By 8 a.m., she checked it 5 more. Nothing. No reply. Her hope began to shrink with every passing minute. By 10 a.m., she was telling herself it was foolish to think she'd hear back so soon. People had lives. People had jobs. Not everyone sitting by the computer like some old lovesick fool, she thought bitterly. At 10:37 a.m., a ping echoed from the laptop. Her eyes snapped to it so fast she nearly spilled her tea. Her hands trembled as she moved the cursor to the notification. She hesitated, took a breath, and clicked it. The subject line read, "From Henry Whitmore." Her breath caught in her chest. For a moment, she didn't move. She just stared at it, her mind suddenly blank. She felt like she was 17 again, standing on the edge of something she couldn't see. Her fingers hovered over the mouse, then slowly she clicked. The message opened. "Evelyn, is it really you? I had to read your message 3 times just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. I've thought about you so many times over the years, wondering where life took you. To hear from you now, well, I can't quite put into words how it feels. I'd love to catch up. Tell me everything. I'm all ears." Her hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes before she even realized it was happening. Her whole body felt light, like she'd been unburdened from something she hadn't known she'd been carrying. Her lips quivered as she read the words again, this time slower. She traced each line with her eyes, making sure she hadn't imagined it. "I've thought about you so many times over the years." Her heart squeezed. Her mind flashed back to summer nights by the lake, to the sound of crickets and the glow of fireflies. She remembered his hands warm and steady, pulling her up after she'd slipped on the dock. She remembered the way he laughed, quiet but full of life. He thought about me, too. A soft thump pulled her out of her thoughts. She turned to see Caleb standing in the kitchen doorway, his head tilted, his eyes curious. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes with the back of his hand. "Why are you crying, Grandma?" She sniffed quickly, wiping her face with a napkin. "I'm not crying," she lied, her voice thick. Caleb tilted his head the other way, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, you are," he said matter-of-factly. He walked over and climbed onto the chair next to her, his eyes darting to the laptop screen. He squinted at it, then looked up at her. Did he answer? She pressed her lips together, nodding slowly. "Yeah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He answered. Caleb leaned forward, his face inches from the screen, his eyes scanning the words with precision. He nodded once, satisfied. "He remembers you," he said like it was a fact of science. "Told you." Her laugh came out as a shaky breath, a soft, breathy sound that was more relief than humor. She reached over, ruffling his hair. "Yeah, you told me, all right." He looked up at her, his eyes focused and clear. "Are you going to write back?" She hesitated. The idea of writing back should have been simple. She'd done it once already. But this was different. This was him. This is Henry. She stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. It pulsed like a heartbeat, steady, waiting for her to act. "What should I say?" She muttered, half to herself. "Say what you feel," Caleb said plainly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, still uncertain. "What if I sound foolish?" She asked, more to herself than to him. "Then he'll know it's you," Caleb replied, his eyes unwavering. That made her laugh for real this time. It was a soft, warm laugh that bubbled up from deep in her chest. She looked at him, shaking her head in disbelief. When did you get so wise, huh? I've always been wise, he replied without looking at her, still studying the screen like he was waiting for her to type. She sighed, fingers finally settling on the keys. She typed slowly, each word feeling like a small step forward on an old, forgotten path. Henry, it's me. It's really me. I can hardly believe I'm writing this. I don't know where to start, but I suppose I'll start with thank you. Thank you for remembering me. I thought maybe I'd been tucked away in some forgotten part of your mind, like an old book no one reads anymore. But here you are, and here I am, and it feels like something I never expected to happen. She paused, her hands hovering. Her heart felt so full it might burst. Caleb leaned over, watching her type. Keep going, he said softly, nodding like he knew she needed the push. She smiled at him and continued. I'm older now. We both are, I'm sure. But I've never forgotten you. I see you sometimes in the faces of strangers, in the songs that play on the radio when I'm not expecting it. I didn't think I'd ever get the chance to say hello again, and now here we are. I'd love to catch up if you'd like. Tell me where life has taken you. Tell me everything. I'm all ears, too. She stared at it, her heart thudding louder than ever. Her finger hovered over the send button. This moment felt bigger than she'd imagined it would. Do it, Caleb said quietly beside her, like he knew she was hesitating. Her breath came out slowly, and she pressed send. The message was gone. Sent. Just like that. She sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, her heart pounding, her hands gripping the table like she just stepped off a roller coaster. Caleb didn't say anything. He just sat there, quietly watching her, waiting. Now what? She asked aloud, looking at him. He shrugged. Now you wait. Later that evening, she found herself glancing at the laptop every few minutes, like a teenager waiting for a phone call from a crush. She didn't know why she felt so anxious. She'd lived through so much more than this. She'd raised children, buried a husband, survived heartache, grief, and everything in between. But somehow, the idea of waiting for a reply from Henry Whitmore felt bigger than all of it. That night, she woke up at 2:17 a.m. Her heart was racing, but she didn't know why. She sat up in bed, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering in from the street lamp outside. She sat there for a moment, listening to the sound of her own breathing. Slowly, she got up and shuffled to the kitchen. Her eyes went straight to the laptop. She wasn't planning to check it, but her feet carried her there anyway. She sat down, opened it, and logged in. Her email was open. A new message. Her heart stopped. It was from him. Her hand shook as she clicked it open. Evelyn, I can't tell you how much it means to hear from you. Your message felt like a letter from the past, and I read it twice just to make sure it was real. I'd love to tell you everything, but I'll start with this. I never forgot you either. Never. Life has taken me down many roads, but none of them ever erased you from my heart. Her hand flew to her chest, her breath catching. If you're open to it, I'd love to hear your voice again. I can call, or we can write back and forth for as long as you like. Whatever feels right. But just know this, I'm here. I'm still here, Evelyn. Her eyes blurred with tears, and she sat back in her chair, letting them fall freely. I'm still here, she whispered to herself, and for the first time in a long, long time, she believed it. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, the phone in her hand, her thumb hovering over the green call button like it might burn her. Her other hand tapped anxiously on the wooden tabletop. Why am I so nervous? She thought. I'm 76 years old. I've lived through war, loss, and raising 3 kids. This should be easy. But it wasn't. Her heart was thudding so hard she swore Caleb could hear it from across the room. He sat on the floor, legs crossed, sketching quietly as always, his pencil moving in short, precise strokes. Every so often, he'd glance at her with that knowing look, like he could sense the storm in her chest. "Are you going to call him?" he asked, not looking up from his drawing. Her thumb hovered a little closer to the button, but she still didn't press it. "I'm thinking about it," she replied, her voice tighter than she meant it to be. Caleb glanced up this time, his gaze sharp. "You already thought about it yesterday," he said plainly, tilting his head to the side. "You're just scared." Evelyn's eyes widened. "Excuse me," she said, raising an eyebrow. "You're scared," he repeated, never taking his eyes off her. He wasn't being rude. It wasn't in his nature to be rude. He was just telling the truth as he saw it. It was a part of who he was, seeing things others didn't want to admit. "Since when did you become a therapist?" she muttered, shaking her head. "Since you started acting like one of my puzzles," he said, his pencil still scratching against the paper. "You just have to figure out the next move, that's all." She let out a short laugh, more out of disbelief than humor. Leave it to a 12-year-old to put 60 years of unresolved feelings into one simple sentence. Just figure out the next move. It sounded so easy when he said it. Her eyes drifted back to the phone in her hand. She stared at Henry's name on the screen. It wasn't even his full name, just Henry, and somehow that made it feel even more intimate, more real. Her thumb moved slowly, like it had a mind of its own. She pressed the green button before she could think too hard about it. The dial tone echoed in her ear. Each ring felt like a heartbeat, steady and slow, until it wasn't. It stopped. "Hello." The voice on the other end was warm but deeper than she remembered. A little rougher around the edges, like a song that had been played too many times but still sounded familiar. Her breath caught. She froze. Her mouth open, but no sound came out. "Say something, Evelyn. Say something." "Henry." Her voice was so small she barely recognized it as her own. There was a pause, just for a moment. Then a quiet laugh, soft but sure. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice cracking just a little. "It really is you." Evelyn pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the wild thud of her heart. She squeezed her eyes shut, the warmth of his voice washing over her like a wave. She laughed too, a quiet, breathy sound that felt like relief. "It's me," she said, smiling now, even as tears welled in her eyes. "It's really me." For a moment, there was no sound but their quiet breathing, each of them taking in the weight of the moment. Decades of silence, broken by one simple phone call. "I didn't think I'd ever hear your voice again," Henry said, and she could hear the emotion thick in his throat. "Me neither," she replied, wiping at her eyes with her sleeve. "I almost didn't call." "Why not?" he asked, his voice softer now, like he was afraid of scaring her away. "Because," she hesitated, trying to find the words. She looked over at Caleb, still drawing, his little face calm and focused. He glanced at her once, gave a small nod, then went back to his sketch. "Because I thought maybe I'd been forgotten," she admitted, her voice trembling with the weight of it. "I thought I'd be a stranger to you by now." "Evelyn Harper," Henry said firmly, his voice stronger now. "I'd forget my own name before I'd forget you." Her breath hitched. Tears spilled over, running down her cheeks in warm, quiet rivers. She pressed her hand over her eyes, laughing at herself for being so emotional. "Well, now you've gone and done it," she sniffled, smiling through her tears. "I'm sitting here crying like a fool." "If you're a fool, then I guess I am too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been waiting 60 years to hear from you, Evelyn." They talked like that for over an hour. It wasn't forced, and it wasn't awkward like Evelyn had feared. It was like stepping into a familiar room you haven't seen in a long time, but everything is still exactly where you left it. They talked about the old days, the summer fairs, the lake, the hours they spent in the back of his father's truck watching the stars. She told him about Frank, how good of a man he was, and how much she missed him. Henry told her about his late wife, Mary, and how they built a good life together. They didn't hide the hard parts. They shared the grief, the regrets, and the victories too. Then Henry said something she wasn't ready for. "Evelyn," he said after a long pause, his voice low, careful. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, leaning forward like she was bracing for it. "Why didn't you wait for me?" Her heart stopped. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table, her fingers tracing the old scratches on the wood. Why didn't I wait? She thought she'd buried that question a long time ago, but now it sat there between them, sharp and painful. "I did," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "For a while I did. I wrote you letters, Henry. So many letters. But you never wrote back." Another pause. Longer this time. Her heart ached in that silence. "I never got any letters, Evelyn," he said softly. "Not a single one." Her breath came out in a sharp gasp. Her eyes widened. "No, that can't be right. I sent them. I know I did. I sent one every month for a year. I was stationed overseas," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "Mail got lost all the time. Sometimes it never made it to us." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time it wasn't just grief, it was anger. Not at him, not at herself, but at the years they lost because of something so simple, so small, so utterly beyond their control. All this time, her voice cracked. "I thought you forgot me, Henry." "No," he said firmly. "Not for a second. I thought you'd moved on. Figured you'd found someone better." "I didn't find someone better," she said, her voice breaking. "I just found someone." Her hand pressed against her heart, and she squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to cry anymore, but the tears came anyway. "If I'd known you never got my letters, I would have." "Don't do that," he interrupted gently. "Don't you dare think about the what-ifs. We've both had enough of those to last a lifetime." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We've got right now, don't we?" "Yeah," he replied, his voice warm again. "We've got right now." They sat in silence for a while after that, not needing to fill it with words. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. "You think you'll call me again, Evelyn?" Henry asked after a while, his tone hopeful but cautious. "You think you'll answer if I do?" she shot back, grinning to herself. He laughed, a rich, full laugh that sounded exactly like she remembered. "You call Evelyn. I'll answer every time." Her heart felt light for the first time in years. "Then I guess you better keep your phone nearby, Henry Whitmore," she said with a smile so wide it hurt. "I already am," he replied softly. Later that night, as she sat in her chair watching Caleb's sketch, she smiled to herself. She glanced at the phone on the table, and then at Caleb, her heart feeling fuller than it had in years. "Grandma," Caleb said, not looking up from his drawing, "are you happy now?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "I think I am." Evelyn stared at the letter for a long time, her fingers tracing over the name written on the front, Evelyn Harper. The handwriting was steady, bold, and familiar in a way that made her chest ache. She knew that handwriting. She knew it like the melody of a song she hadn't heard in years, but still somehow remembered every word to. Her eyes shifted to the return address in the corner. Henry Whitmore, Mayfield, Kentucky. Her heart gave a little thud, soft but strong enough to remind her that it was still there, still working. She stood at the mailbox for longer than she should have, her feet frozen in place like they'd sunk into the ground. Her fingers curled around the envelope, gripping it tighter than necessary. "Grandma!" Her head snapped up, startled by the sound of Caleb's voice. He stood on the porch, tilting his head to the side like he always did when he was trying to figure something out. He squinted at her, his sharp little eyes darting from her face to the envelope in her hand. "You're just standing there," he said, his voice clear but flat. "Is it bad news?" "No, honey," she said quickly, shaking her head as if the motion might clear away the fog in her mind. She turned, walking toward the porch with slower, more careful steps. "It's not bad news. Just unexpected." Caleb's eyes followed her movements like a cat tracking a bird. "You gonna open it?" "Eventually," she muttered as she reached the door. Caleb raised one eyebrow, still squinting. "That's what people say when they're scared," he replied, his voice blunt and matter-of-fact. Her head jerked toward him, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not scared," she said firmly, pointing at him with the envelope. "You are," he said, walking inside ahead of her, his little feet padding softly on the hardwood floor. "You're doing the thing you do when you fold towels that are already folded." He flopped onto the couch, pulling a sketch pad from his backpack. "I see everything, Grandma." Evelyn sighed, shutting the door behind her. She walked to the kitchen, set the envelope on the table, and stood there for a moment. Her eyes flicked to the counter where her dish towels sat, folded perfectly into neat little squares. She frowned. He notices too much, she thought. Her gaze went back to the envelope. It sat there like it was watching her, like it knew she wouldn't be able to leave it alone for long. She sat down slowly, her eyes locked on it. She traced the edge of it with her thumb, then flipped it over. Her fingers hovered at the seal. "Just open it, Evelyn. It's just a letter." Her fingers slipped under the flap, tearing it slowly, like she was defusing a bomb. She pulled the paper out and unfolded it carefully. Her breath caught the moment she saw his handwriting. It wasn't neat like it used to be, but it was still Henry. She could see him in every letter, every curve of every NY. Her eyes moved to the top of the page. Evelyn. Her breath caught again. It's him. It's really him. It feels strange writing to you after all this time, but something about it feels right too. I'm not as good with words as I used to be, so forgive me if this is a little messy. I've been thinking about you since that call. I've been thinking about us. I wonder if you still hum when you cook or if you still forget to take your gloves off when you garden. I wonder if you remember the time we got stuck on that old Ferris wheel when the power went out and we spent half an hour talking about what we'd do if the world ended. You said you want to live by a lake, and I said I'd want to own a bookstore. Funny how I still think about that. Evelyn felt a sharp, hot prick behind her eyes. Her fingers pressed against her lips, her eyes darting down the page as she read faster. Her heart felt like it was racing to catch up with her mind. I'm not writing just to reminisce, though. I'm writing because I want to see you. Her breath hitched. Her eyes flicked to that sentence like it had been written in bold, glowing letters. She read it again, slower this time. I want to see you. Her heart thudded hard in her chest. What is he saying? She thought, her eyes moving to the next part of the letter. If you're open to it, I'd like you to come visit me. I know it's a lot to ask. I know it's been 60 years. But I think about how little time we've got left, and I'm tired of waiting. I'm tired of thinking, maybe next year. It's not too late, Evelyn. I'll even pick you up from the bus station myself if you'll let me. Her fingers gripped the paper tighter as she stared at the words. Her eyes stayed on the last line. It's not too late, Evelyn. Her chest ached, and she didn't know if it was joy or sadness, but it was big and it was real. She could feel it in every part of her. Grandma. Her head snapped up. Caleb was standing at the kitchen entrance, watching her like she was a puzzle with one missing piece. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. What's it say? Evelyn pressed the letter to her chest, hiding it like a secret she wasn't ready to share. It's nothing, honey. Just an old friend reaching out. Caleb tilted his head the other way, studying her with the kind of patience only he had. Is it him? He asked. He didn't say Henry's name. He didn't have to. Her eyes softened. She gave a small nod. Yeah, she said, barely able to get the word out. It's him. He nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on her face. He wants you to visit, doesn't he? Her eyes widened. How'd you? You're holding it like it's gonna jump out of your hands, he said plainly, walking over to sit next to her at the table. He tapped the letter with his finger. Are you gonna go? Her heart jumped at the question. She glanced down at the paper in her lap. She folded it slowly, her fingers pressing the creases down as perfectly as she'd pressed those towels. I don't know, Caleb, she said, not looking at him. It's been a long time. People change. No, they don't, he said matter-of-factly, swinging his legs under the chair. They just get older. She snorted a laugh, wiping at her eyes. Where'd you get so smart, huh? Always been smart, he replied, tapping his head. You just noticed. That night, Evelyn sat in her chair by the window, the letter on the table beside her. The streetlights cast long shadows on the floor, and her heart was as loud as it had been that morning at the mailbox. She glanced at her suitcase in the corner of the room. It hadn't been touched in years. Dust lined the zipper. Her eyes moved to the letter. It's not too late, Evelyn. She sat forward, staring at the suitcase. Her fingers tapped against the armrest. She stared for so long that her fingers started tapping in a rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The next morning, Evelyn was up before the sun. Caleb woke up to the sound of wheels rolling across the hardwood. He rubbed his eyes and sat up on the couch, blinking at the sight in front of him. Evelyn, her coat on, her suitcase by the door. Where you going, Grandma? He asked, his voice groggy but alert. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes sharp and steady. I want to see about a bookstore, she said with a wink. Caleb tilted his head, confused for a second. But then slowly, a smile tugged at his face. He nodded once, satisfied. Good, he said, lying back down on the couch. About time. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time she didn't wipe them away. She just smiled as she zipped up her suitcase. Yeah, she whispered to herself. About time. The bus ride to Mayfield, Kentucky, was longer than Evelyn expected. Each mile felt like it stretched into the next, the rolling hills and empty highways blurring into a quiet hum of green and gray. She sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, fingers twisting the fabric of her coat. Her suitcase sat in the luggage compartment below, but it wasn't her clothes she was thinking about. It was him, Henry. Her heart hadn't stopped its steady thud since she'd boarded the bus. Every so often she glanced at her phone, checking for messages even though she knew he wouldn't send one. They'd agreed on a plan. He'd be waiting at the bus station. She didn't need another reminder. But still, she checked. First time going to Mayfield, asked a woman across the aisle. She was older too, maybe in her 60s, her gray hair tucked neatly into a colorful headscarf. Not exactly, Evelyn replied with a small smile. But it's been a long time. The woman nodded knowingly, like she understood something Evelyn didn't say. Long trips like this make you think, don't they? More than I'd like, Evelyn admitted, glancing back at the window. She watched a red barn whip past, her mind drifting to memories of nights by the lake, Henry's hand holding hers, his laugh low and soft like a song only she could hear. Her chest tightened. You going to see family? The woman pressed. Evelyn hesitated. An old friend, she said softly, the words tasting more significant than they should. Old friends are the best kind, the woman replied, leaning back in her seat with a satisfied sigh. No need to explain yourself to them. They already know all your stories. Evelyn felt that one in her bones. Yeah, but sometimes they don't know how the story ends. The bus rolled into Mayfield just past 2 p.m. The small town looked exactly like she imagined it would. A quiet main street lined with mom-and-pop stores, an old movie theater with the letters half fallen from the marquee, and a single diner with a neon sign that buzzed faintly in the daylight. The bus station wasn't much more than a metal bench under a canopy with a rusted roof. Evelyn stepped off slowly, her legs stiff from the ride. She glanced around, heart thudding harder now. Her eyes darted from one face to the next. Teenagers on their phones. A man in a flannel jacket carrying groceries. A young couple arguing quietly. No Henry. Her breath came quicker. What if he changed his mind? She thought, her hands gripping the strap of her purse tighter. What if he didn't come? Evelyn. Her heart stopped. She turned slowly, the sound of his voice so familiar it felt like walking into an old house she hadn't visited in years. And there he was, Henry Whitmore. He stood about 20 feet away, hands in his coat pockets, his shoulders a little hunched, but his eyes were the same. Brown and warm, like autumn leaves. He smiled slowly, not all at once, but gradually, like he was still figuring out how it felt. His silver hair was combed back, his face lined with age, but none of it mattered. It was him. Her breath hitched, and she pressed a hand to her chest. Her feet didn't move right away. She just stood there, taking him in, like she was afraid he'd disappear if she blinked. "Don't make me come over there, Evelyn," he called, grinning wide now, his voice louder, bolder. Her laugh came out as a choked sob, her hand covering her mouth. She took one step, then another, and before she realized it, she was walking faster. Henry met her halfway. His hands came out of his pockets, his arms opening wide, and before she knew it, she was in them. He pulled her in close, so close she could smell the faint scent of aftershave and old leather. Her head rested on his shoulder, her arms around his back, and for the first time in 60 years, she felt safe. She squeezed her eyes shut, letting the tears fall without a fight. 60 years, she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's been 60 years, Henry." "I know," he whispered back, his voice thick. "Too long." They stood there for a while, just holding on. No words. No need for them. The world spun, the traffic passed, but for them, time was still. Eventually, Henry pulled back, his hands still on her shoulders. His eyes scanned her face, every line, every wrinkle, like he was memorizing her all over again. "You look just like I remember," he said softly, his smile growing wider. "Oh, hush," she said, wiping her face with her sleeve. "I look like I've been through 60 years of storms, and you know it." "Storms suit you," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "They made you stronger." Her heart swelled. "Storms suit you." She wasn't sure if that was the most romantic thing she'd ever heard or the truest. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the street. "I'm parked right over there." They walked side by side, their pace slow, unhurried. His car was an old blue pickup truck that looked like it had been around as long as they had. He opened the passenger door for her, and she laughed, giving him a playful look. "You still doing this old gentleman routine?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Every chance I get," he said, flashing her a grin. "You'll just have to get used to it." The drive to his house was quiet but comfortable. They didn't have to fill it with words. The weight of his presence next to her was enough. She glanced at him a few times, catching him doing the same. He'd smile every time she caught him. His house sat at the edge of town, a small white cottage with blue shutters and a front porch big enough for 2 rocking chairs. He parked the truck, and for a moment, neither of them moved. They just sat there, letting the moment stretch out. "You okay?" he asked, glancing over at her. She nodded, still staring out the window at the house. "Yeah," she said quietly. It's a lot." "I know," he said, his voice warm. "Take your time." He got out first, walking slowly to her side. We opened her door. She glanced up at him, eyes soft but steady. "Henry?" she asked, still sitting in the truck. "Yeah." Her eyes flickered with something unspoken. "I thought I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. But I never did." He nodded slowly, understanding without her needing to explain. He held out his hand. "Come on, Evelyn. You're home." She took his hand. That night, they sat on his front porch, sipping coffee as the sun dipped low on the horizon. They didn't talk about the past too much. They didn't have to. Sometimes the only thing you need is the person sitting next to you. But just as she thought everything had settled, Henry cleared his throat. "There's something I should tell you, Evelyn," he said, his voice low, cautious. She glanced over, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" He hesitated, his eyes scanning the distant trees like he was searching for the right words. His hand rubbed the back of his neck. He's nervous, she realized. She hadn't seen him like this since the day he asked her to dance at the town fair. "Back when I left for the army," he said slowly, his eyes on the horizon. "I didn't lose your letters, Evelyn." His voice broke a little. "They were kept from me. My father, he thought I needed to focus. Thought you'd be a distraction." Her breath stopped. Her eyes locked on him, wide with shock. "Kept from me. By the time I found out, you were already gone," he said, his eyes wet now. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn. I didn't know. I didn't know." Her chest ached in a way she didn't have words for. Her eyes filled with tears, and she pressed a hand to her heart. "All those years," she whispered. "All that time we thought." Henry reached over, taking her hand in his, squeezing it tight. "No more looking back," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We're here now. Right here." She nodded, tears falling freely now. Her heart, so full of grief and joy all at once, swelled until she thought it might break. "Right here," she whispered, squeezing his hand tighter. For the first time in 60 years, she wasn't wondering what could have been. She was living it.